The name on the folded paper was written in a dead man's handwriting, and Martin Garrett had been staring at it for 3 days straight before he finally saddled his horse and rode toward Coldwater Creek. He had not wanted this job. That was the truth of it, plain and unadorned as the scrub flats he was riding across in the late September of 1878. The sun sat low and mean in the Texas sky, throwing long orange light across the yellow grass, and Martin kept his hat pulled down against the glare and his eyes fixed on the trail ahead. His horse, a dun gelding named Copper who had outlasted 2 other men's ownership, moved at an easy walk that ate up the miles without fuss. The name on the paper was Maggie Underwood. He had gotten it from a man named Cecil Harrow, which was already a strike against the whole enterprise. Cecil Harrow was the kind of man who wore his dishonesty on his face like a second mustache, and he ran a small lending operation out of a back room above the Ivory Saloon in Abilene. Martin had done work for Cecil before, the kind of work that did not require a badge and did not welcome too many questions, mostly tracking men who had borrowed money and then thought the distance of the Texas plains would protect them from repayment. Martin was good at finding people. He was less enthusiastic about what happened once he found them. But this was different, Cecil had said. This was a woman named Maggie Underwood who had borrowed $42.60 from Cecil's operation 2 winters ago when her husband, a man named Thomas Underwood, had come in desperate for cash. Thomas Underwood had signed the note himself. Thomas Underwood had, according to Cecil, since died of a fever last spring. And now the debt sat unresolved, attached to a widow who had moved south toward Coldwater Creek, and Cecil wanted his money. Martin had taken the job because he needed the $8 Cecil was offering, and because he told himself it was simple enough. Ride out, explain the debt, arrange some kind of payment or settlement, ride back. He was not a cruel man. He did not intend to make a widow's life harder than it already was. He just needed the $8. He told himself that again as Copper climbed a low ridge and the valley of Coldwater Creek opened up below him in the evening light. It was prettier than he expected. The creek itself was a thin silver line threading through cottonwood trees that had gone gold with the season, their leaves catching the last of the day's light like scattered coins. A handful of small farms sat in the valley, each one showing smoke from supper fires, and the nearest one, the one matching the direction Cecil had scratched on a second piece of paper, sat at the eastern edge of the cottonwood grove. It had a low porch, a good-looking vegetable garden that had been put to bed for winter, and a small barn painted red that someone had clearly taken care of. Martin stopped Copper at the top of the ridge and looked down at that farm for a long moment. He had a speech prepared. He had been working on it for 3 days. It was a reasonable speech, businesslike and not unkind, explaining that the debt had transferred with the estate, that Cecil Harrow was willing to work out a payment arrangement, that there was no need for unpleasantness if everyone behaved sensibly. He had the speech so well organized in his head that he could run through it forward and backward without missing a beat. He rode down the ridge in the cooling evening and stopped Copper at the gate of the small farm. There was a woman in the yard. She was carrying a wooden bucket from the well toward the house, and she was not looking at him, not yet. She was wearing a plain brown dress with the sleeves rolled to her elbows despite the chill, and her dark hair was pinned up, but coming loose on one side in a way that suggested she had been working hard since morning. She moved with a particular kind of purposeful efficiency that Martin had seen in people who worked alone and had learned not to waste any motion. Then she turned and saw him at the gate, and Martin Garrett forgot every single word he had prepared. It was not that she was beautiful, though she was. It was not that she looked startled, though she did, one hand going to her chest and the bucket swinging out before she steadied it. It was something in the exact quality of her looking at him, straight and direct and entirely unafraid, the kind of look that assessed a situation and did not flinch from what it found. Her eyes were dark, almost black in the evening light, and they were fixed on him with an attention that made him feel, inexplicably and immediately, that he should be better than he was. "Can I help you?" she said. It was not quite a question. Martin opened his mouth. Nothing came out. He was aware, in a distant and horrified way, that he was sitting on his horse at a stranger's gate with his mouth open like a man who had never learned to speak. He closed his mouth. He took his hat off, which seemed like the right gesture even if he could not follow it with actual words. He looked down at his hat. He looked back up at her. "My name is Martin Garrett," he said finally, and his voice came out rougher than he intended, scraped over by disuse and the dry air. She was still looking at him. The bucket was steady in her hand now. "I heard the name," she said. "Did it come with a reason for standing at my gate?" He thought of the paper in his coat pocket. He thought of Cecil Harrow's instructions. He thought of the $42.60 and the note her dead husband had signed. "I was hoping to speak with you," he said, "if you have a moment." She considered him for another long beat, the kind of assessment that made him feel his hat needed replacing, and his coat had seen better years, both of which were true. Then she set the bucket down on the porch steps and wiped her hands on her apron. "I have a few moments," she said. "You can tie your horse to the post and come sit on the porch, Mr. Garrett. I will not invite a stranger into my house, but I'm not so ungracious that I will make you talk to a gate." He tied copper to the post. He walked up the short path to the porch. He sat in the offered chair, a sturdy wooden thing with a faded cushion, and she sat across from him on the porch rail with her arms folded, and looked at him and waited. And Martin Garrett, who had tracked wanted men across 3 states and negotiated debts with every kind of difficult personality the frontier could produce, found himself at a complete and total loss for how to say what he had come to say. "It is a good farm," he said instead. Something in her expression shifted, not quite softening but changing. "It was my husband's farm," she said. "Now it is mine. He has been gone since April." "I heard about that," Martin said. "I am sorry for your loss." She looked at him with those dark eyes. "Are you?" she said. "That is an interesting place to begin, Mr. Garrett, with condolences. Most men who ride out here alone at supper time are not beginning with condolences." He looked at his hands. He looked at her. He thought about Cecil Harrow and the $8 and the note on the paper in his pocket. "Mrs. Underwood," he began. "Maggie," she said. "Mrs. Underwood sounds like someone reading from a church registry. What is it you came to say?" And he looked at her. This woman who had clearly earned every line of competence in her face, who had put a farm to bed for winter with her own 2 hands and carried water from her well in the cooling dark, who had just told him her husband had been dead since April without a single tremor in her voice, because she was the kind of woman who had already done her trembling in private. He looked at her and he thought about the piece of paper in his pocket and the speech he had prepared for 3 days, and something in him, some calculation he had not been aware of running, completed itself and arrived at an answer he had not expected. He could not do it. He sat there on Maggie Underwood's porch in the last of the evening light, and he could not make himself pull out that paper and talk to her about Cecil Harrow's $42.60. Not tonight. Not like this. "I came to ask if you knew anyone in the area hiring," he said instead, which was not a lie exactly, since he was now in genuine need of a job that was not the one Cecil had sent him to do. Maggie Underwood blinked. It was the first time he had seen her uncertainty, brief and real, before her expression settled back into its careful attention. "You rode out to Coldwater Creek to ask about work," she said slowly. "Yes, ma'am." "From where?" "Abilene." "That is nearly 2 days' ride to ask about ranch work." "I have been traveling south regardless," he said, which was also not entirely a lie, because he had considered going south for a while now, in the vague way a man considers things when his present situation is not satisfying him. She was quiet for a moment, studying him with an expression that suggested she believed approximately 40% of what she was hearing, but was not certain enough of the other 60 to say so. "Jim Callie at the Double C might be looking for a hand," she said at last. "He runs 300 head and his oldest boy went east for school. You can find his place 2 miles north on the main road." "Thank you," Martin said. Another silence. A coyote started up somewhere on the ridge, and the cottonwoods moved in the evening breeze, and the lamplight coming through Maggie's front window made a warm yellow rectangle on the porch boards. "You should eat before you ride to Call's place," she said abruptly. "I have stew on. It would be wasteful to send a man away from a supper conversation on an empty stomach." Martin looked up at her. She was already standing, already reaching for her bucket, her face turned away in a way that suggested she had surprised herself with the invitation and was not going to acknowledge it directly. "I appreciate that," he said. He followed her inside. The house was small and impeccably kept. It had the particular neatness of someone who lived alone and had organized their space to be functional above all else. Everything in its place. The cookstove clean and well-maintained. A row of jars along one shelf holding dried herbs and what looked like preserves put up for the winter. There was a table with 2 chairs, a braided rug on the floor, and a bookshelf holding 8 or 9 volumes that Martin found himself glancing at with more interest than he intended. "You have books," he said. "I do," she said, ladling stew into 2 bowls with the efficiency of someone who was not looking to make a production of feeding a stranger. "My father believed in books. He left me those when he died." "What kind of books?" She glanced over her shoulder. A surprising question from a man who came looking for ranch work. "I can be surprised by myself on occasion." She almost smiled. He caught the edge of it before it disappeared. She brought the bowls to the table and sat down, and Martin hung his coat on the peg by the door because the house was warm and because it felt like the right thing to do, and then he sat across from her and they ate. The stew was good. It was the kind of food that told you something about the person who had made it, careful with seasoning, nothing wasted, made with what was available but made with attention. Martin ate slowly and tried to remember the last time he had eaten at an actual table across from an actual person who was not either a client or a subject of collection. "He died in April," Maggie said, without preamble, somewhere in the middle of the meal. She was looking at her bowl. "Thomas." He had always been a man of small worries and large plans. The fever took him in less than 2 weeks. She paused. "He was not a bad man. I want to be honest about that. He was not a bad man, but he was not a careful one." Martin was quiet because there was nothing to say to that would not be either inadequate or presumptuous. "He left debts," she said, and now she looked up at him, direct and steady, and Martin felt the back of his neck go cold. "Did he send you?" It was not a question this time either. Martin put down his spoon. He could lie. He was capable of it, and he had done it before in situations considerably more morally straightforward than this one. He could lie and eat the rest of his stew and leave and ride to Jim Call's place and get legitimate work and send Cecil Harrow $8 from his own pocket to square things and never come back to Coldwater Creek. He looked at Maggie Underwood's face and he thought about what it cost a woman like her to ask that question in that steady voice. "Cecil Harrow sent me," he said. She exhaled very slowly. "The note from 2 winters ago." "Yes." $42.60. "Yes." She looked at the table for a long moment. The lamplight moved over her face and Martin watched her absorb the information and redistribute it into the architecture of her situation, the way a person does when they are already carrying a full load and have just been handed one more thing. "I cannot pay it," she said. "Not all at once. Not now, with winter coming." She looked up at him. "Is he going to send someone to take the farm?" "He cannot take the farm," Martin said, and he was sure of this because he had asked Cecil directly before riding out, needing to understand what he was actually being sent to do. Texas homestead law protects the primary residence. He knows that. He is hoping for a payment arrangement or for you to put up some other asset as collateral. "I do not have any other assets," she said. "I have what you see here. A farm and a barn and 30 head of cattle and a vegetable garden and a smokehouse with enough pork to see me through winter if I am careful." She paused. "I should have known Thomas had borrowed from someone like Harrow. He was always looking for a shortcut." Martin picked up his spoon again. He was not sure why. "I came to tell you about the debt," he said. "Not to collect it tonight. That was never the arrangement." "What was the arrangement?" "I was to inform you of the outstanding obligation and convey Cecil's willingness to discuss terms." He looked at his bowl. "I am less interested in Cecil's terms than I was when I left Abilene." "Mr. Garrett," her voice was careful. "I know," he said. "I am a debt collector who is telling you he does not want to collect. I understand how that sounds." "It sounds like a man who is perhaps in the wrong line of work," she said, and there was something in her voice now that had not been there before, something that was not quite warmth but was adjacent to it, the way the sky looks right before the sun actually crests the horizon. Martin ate the rest of his stew. Maggie ate the rest of hers. The lamp between them filled the room with its soft, unsteady light, and outside the coyote had moved on, and the night had settled into the particular quiet of the open country where silence is not absence but presence. "I will talk to Cecil Harrow," Martin said, when the bowls were empty. "I will explain that the debt predates your involvement, that the note was your husband's obligation, that pursuing it against a widow farming alone would cost him more in reputation than the $42 is worth." He paused. "I cannot guarantee he will listen." "He will not listen," Maggie said. "Probably not," Martin agreed. "But I will try." She looked at him for a long, searching moment. In the lamplight, her eyes were even darker than they had seemed outside, and there was something in them that made him feel exposed in the way that only happens when someone is actually seeing you rather than the impression you are trying to make. "Why?" she said. "You do not know me. You came here to collect a debt, not to fight one." He did not have a clean answer for that. He had several answers that were honest but complicated, and several that were simple but not quite true, and he had a feeling that she would identify the difference without much difficulty. So he said the thing that was both true and simple even if it was not complete. "Because sitting across from you at your table is the first time in a considerable while that I have felt like a decent man," he said. "And I am reluctant to give that up by acting like an indecent one." The silence that followed was of a different quality than the silences before it. Maggie looked at him for what felt like a long time, and the lamp flickered once in some draught he could not locate, and then she stood and began to clear the bowls with very steady hands. "You should sleep in the barn tonight," she said. "It is too dark to ride to Call's place safely, and there is no sense wasting a man's neck on a ridge trail in the dark just because he said an honest thing." Martin did not argue. He thanked her and took his coat from the peg, and she handed him a spare blanket from a chest by the door, and he went out to the barn, and Copper greeted him with the mild disinterest of a horse who had seen his owner in stranger situations and was long past judgment. Martin lay in the barn hay that night and stared at the slats of the roof above him and thought about what he was going to do, which was a more complicated question than it had been that morning. He did not sleep well. He was up before dawn, feeding Copper and watching the thin gray light come up over the ridge, when he heard the farmhouse door and turned to see Maggie coming across the yard with a coffee pot and 2 cups balanced with the ease of someone who had done it many times before. She handed him a cup and poured without preamble and stood beside him at the barn door looking out at the gray and gold of the early morning, and they drank coffee together in the comfortable quiet of 2 people who have already said the important things. "I want to tell you something," she said when both cups were half empty. "All right. I knew someone would come eventually. I have been preparing for it since I found Thomas's papers in May." She kept her eyes on the ridgeline. "I sold 2 of the best cattle in June to put money aside. I have almost $30 saved. I cannot pay it all at once, but I am not helpless." Martin looked at her profile in the morning light. She had her hair pinned back neat and clean, and there was something about the way she held herself against the dawn, straight and solid and entirely undramatic, that made his chest do something he had not been expecting and was not prepared to name. "I know you are not helpless," he said. She glanced at him then. "Most men look at a woman alone on a farm and see helpless. I looked at you and saw a woman who had done more work this week than I have done this month," he said. "Helpless did not occur to me. She looked back at the ridgeline. "The stew was better than it usually is," she said, which was one of the more oblique things anyone had ever said to him, and which he spent a moment unpacking before he understood that she meant the presence of company had improved it, and the warmth that moved through him at that understanding was something he chose not to examine too carefully in the gray light of the morning. "I am going to ride back to Abilene today," he said. "I need to talk to Cecil Harrow. And then I am going to try to settle this thing in a way that does not require you to empty your savings account into his pocket." He turned his cup in his hands. "And I might take that job at Callie's place when I come back this way, if it is still open." She turned and looked at him full on then, and in the morning light her face was different than it had been in the lamplight, more real and more complicated, the particular face of a person who has survived something and knows it and is still deciding what to do with that knowledge. "It might still be open," she said. "Jim Callie is not a man who fills positions quickly." Martin finished his coffee and handed back the cup. He saddled Copper and rode out as the sun was clearing the ridge, and when he reached the gate he turned once, and she was still standing at the barn door watching him go with her arms folded and her coffee cup in her hand, and he turned back to the road and thought about $42.60, and about the way a woman's face looked when she trusted you a small amount more than she had trusted you the night before. The ride back to Abilene took a day and a half. Cecil Harrow was in his back room when Martin arrived, counting something in a ledger with the concentration of a man whose relationship with money was essentially spiritual. He looked up when Martin came in and folded his hands on the desk with the studied patience of a man who expected to be given exactly what he wanted. "Well," Cecil said. "She has almost $30 saved," Martin said. "She will pay 10 a month until the debt is cleared. Her husband contracted it, not her, but she acknowledges the family obligation and is willing to meet it on reasonable terms." Cecil's expression shifted in the way that expressions shift when a person is calculating something. "The note accrues interest. The note is 2 years old and the person who signed it is dead," Martin said. "You can try to claim interest in a Texas court if you want to spend the legal fees. Or you can take $10 a month for 4 months and close the account." Cecil looked at him. "She is a widow farming alone," Martin said. "Whatever you think about the money, pursuing it aggressively will do more damage to your reputation in this county than the amount is worth. I have had enough dealings in this territory to know that word travels." There was a silence in which Cecil Harrow did the arithmetic that all men of his kind eventually did, weighing the actual money against the social cost and the legal obstacle, and arrived at the conclusion that Martin had expected him to arrive at. "10 a month for 4 months and I close the account," Cecil said. "And you tell her the first payment is due by the end of October." "I will tell her," Martin said. He collected his $8, which felt dirtier in his pocket than usual, and walked out into the bright Abilene afternoon and stood on the boardwalk and looked up and down the street and thought about what came next. What came next was, apparently, riding back south to Coldwater Creek. He stopped at the general store first and bought a new bandana because his old one was beyond saving, and he bought a tin of coffee and a small paper of tobacco and a new notebook, and he stood at the counter and thought about whether there was anything else he might bring that would be appropriate and not presumptuous, and the store owner's wife, who had been watching him deliberate for too long, said, "There are dried apples if you are looking for a gift." Martin bought the dried apples. He rode south. Jim Callie at the Double C was a large, slow-talking man with a sunburned neck and a genuine shortage of help, and he hired Martin on the spot for $30 a month in meals, which was a fair wage for the work, and meant that Martin would have income that was not dependent on Cecil Harrow's assignments. He moved into the bunkhouse that evening, a clean enough place with 6 other hands, and lay in his bunk looking at the ceiling and felt, for the first time in several months, something that resembled a plan. He did not ride to Maggie Underwood's farm immediately. He gave it a week, because she had not invited him back and because arriving too quickly would look either desperate or suspicious, and because he was already spending enough of his thinking time on a woman he had met twice, which was more than was warranted by any rational accounting. At the end of the week, he rode over after his work was done, in the early evening, and found her splitting wood behind the house with an efficiency that suggested she had been doing it for years. She looked up when she heard copper, and something in her face did the thing he had noticed before. That small, almost not a change that was the equivalent, in her particular vocabulary of expression, of a smile. "You came back," she said. "I talked to Cecil Harrow," he said. $10 a month for 4 months and he closes the account. No interest." She set the axe down on the chopping block and looked at him. "How did you manage that?" I explained the situation in terms he could understand. Those terms being legal cost versus return. He got down from copper. I also mentioned the broader social consequences of being known as the man who pursued a widow's inherited debt in a small county. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Thank you, Mr. Garrett." "Martin," he said. She looked at him. "Martin," she said, and his name in her mouth was a different thing than it had been in anyone else's. He helped her finish the wood because it was there and she was doing it, and he had 2 working arms that were not otherwise occupied. She did not tell him to stop, which he took as acceptance. They worked in the easy rhythm of 2 people who had figured out how to exist in the same space without getting in each other's way, and when the wood was split and stacked, she dusted off her hands and looked at the neat pile with satisfaction. "I took work at Jim Call's place," he said, because she had not asked but probably had been wondering. "I heard," she said. "Jim mentioned it at the trading post, said he had a new hand named Garrett who knew horses." "I know horses," Martin said. "Is that the whole of it?" "Mostly," he said. "I also know how to mend fence and track lost cattle and identify a water problem before it becomes a crisis." "Jim Calley is a lucky man," she said. And again there was that edge in her voice, the warmth-adjacent thing, and Martin thought that if she ever actually smiled at him directly and without ambiguity, he might need to sit down. She fed him supper again. It had become a thing, apparently, that when he came in the evening there would be supper, and he began to come in the evening as often as he could manage without it seeming like a habit, which it was, and without letting on that he had been thinking about coming all day, which he had. They talked. That was the center of it, the thing he had not expected, and which was doing something very thorough to the internal landscape he had maintained for some years with considerable effort. They talked about everything, about the farm and the cattle and the ranch work at Call's, about the books on her shelf and the father who had left them to her, about the shape of the territory and the changes coming, about small things and large ones. And she listened with her full attention and spoke with precision and disagreed with him when she thought he was wrong, which was often enough to be interesting. There was an evening in mid-October when the first real cold came down from the north, and she brought out a second lamp against the dark, and they sat at the table with cups of coffee and a book of maps she had gotten from somewhere, talking about places neither of them had been, and Martin watched her trace a line on the map with her finger, and thought that he had not been this comfortable in a room with another person since he was very young, and had not expected to be again. "You are staring," she said, without looking up from the map. "I apologize," he said. "I do not mind." She looked up then. "I am trying to figure out what you are thinking." "I was thinking that this is a very good room," he said carefully. She held his gaze for a beat. "I think so too," she said quietly. The first payment to Cecil Harrow went out in a letter with $10 in October, and Martin rode to Abilene with it himself because he wanted to be certain it arrived and was properly credited. He stood in front of Cecil's desk and watched Cecil write out the receipt and felt something shift in the structure of his life, some weight redistributing itself in a way that left him lighter and more uncertain at the same time. On the way back through Abilene, he ran into a man named Roy Hester, who was a former associate from his previous line of work, broad and ungenerous in both body and character, and who said, with the pointed geniality of a man who is not actually being genial, that he heard Martin had gone soft out there in the Creek country, And was it true that he had sweet-talked a widow's debt down to nothing for her? Martin looked at Roy Hester for a long moment. "I negotiated a reasonable settlement," he said. "That is what I was hired to do." Roy Hester smiled in the way that men smile when they are building toward something unpleasant. "Harrow is not pleased," he said. "Says you left money on the table out of sentiment." "Harrow got his money," Martin said, "on a schedule that was achievable. That is what negotiation means." He rode back to Coldwater Creek and did not think about Roy Hester more than was necessary. November came in with cold, clear days and nights that dropped below freezing, and the work at Call's ranch grew heavier as the cattle needed bringing in closer, and the fences that had been neglected in summer needed attention before the worst of the winter. Martin worked hard and was satisfied by it in the direct, uncomplicated way that physical work satisfies when it has a clear purpose, and in the evenings, 3 or 4 times a week now, he rode the 2 miles to Maggie's farm. She had gotten the animals all secured. The cattle were in the lower pasture with good water access. The chickens were in the barn where they would stay warm, and the kitchen garden had been fully cleared and the soil turned for spring. She had a way of preparing for things that Martin found steadying in himself, as though her competence at managing what was coming helped him believe that what was coming could be managed. One evening in November, when the cold had sharpened enough that Maggie had lit the small fireplace in the main room, they were sitting across from each other in the firelight, she with her mending and he with the Cali Ranch's second set of accounts, which Jim Cali had asked him to look over because he had noticed Martin was both literate and numerically competent. And Martin looked up from the accounts and found Maggie looking at him with an expression he had not seen before. It was not the assessing look she had given him the first night at the gate, though it contained some of that. It was something more open, more direct, and it made him very still. "I want to say something," she said. "All right. I am not a woman who says things she does not mean," she began, setting her mending down. "And I am not a woman who says things before she has thought them through to their conclusion." She looked at the fire for a moment. "I was married for 6 years. Thomas was not a cruel man, but we were not well suited to each other, and I think we both knew it by the 2nd year and neither of us said so, and that left a kind of distance that I grew accustomed to." She paused. "I became accustomed to being alone in the ways that matter." Martin set the accounts aside. "You have been sitting in this room 3 and 4 evenings a week for 6 weeks, she said, "and in that time I have not been alone in any of the ways that matter, and I have not gotten used to that, which is notable." Martin looked at her. The firelight was doing something very specific to her face, warm and uneven, and she was looking at him with that full direct attention that she gave everything. And he thought about every careless thing he had ever done with his life, and felt a kind of fierce retroactive regret for all of it, because here was something that required a person to have been worth it, and he was not entirely sure he qualified. "Maggie," he said, and stopped. "I know," she said. "I am not asking for anything. I am just telling you the truth because I have decided I prefer to live in the truth, particularly with people I respect." "I came to your door to collect a debt," he said. "And then you sat down to supper and forgot why you had come," she said, and there was the smile, finally clear and direct and entirely unambiguous, and it was exactly what he had suspected it would be, the kind of thing that rearranged the room. "I did not forget," he said slowly. "I decided it was less important than I had thought." "That is a meaningful distinction," she said. "I want to be honest with you," he said. "I have not lived a particularly careful life. The work I have been doing for the last few years, collecting debts for men like Cecil Harrow, writing for whoever paid me, it is not the record of a man who has been building toward something." "I am not interested in your record," she said. "I am interested in you sitting in this chair." "You should be interested in the record," he said. "You are a careful woman. You deserve to make careful choices." She looked at him steadily. "I am making a careful choice," she said. "That is what this conversation is." The fire settled and sent a drift of sparks up the chimney, and Martin Garrett looked at Maggie Underwood in her fire-lit room, and thought that a man could spend his whole life riding across open country, never understanding what he was looking for, and arrive at a gate on a September evening having been sent for the worst possible reason, and find the answer there in the form of a woman with dark eyes, and a bucket of water and a look that demanded he be better than he had been. "I would like to court you properly," he said, "if you are willing. I am already the kind of woman who feeds strange debt collectors supper and gives them blankets for the barn," she said. "I believe we are somewhat past the initial stages of proper." He laughed. It came out of him genuinely and without warning, and she smiled at the sound of it, and the room was warm and the fire was good and Coldwater Creek ran silver outside in the dark. He rode back to Call's bunkhouse that night later than usual, and the other hands were asleep, and he lay in his bunk looking at the ceiling and felt the particular warmth of a man who has discovered that the country has more to offer than he had given it credit for. November deepened, and the courtship, if you could call it that, had the quality of something that had been going on for longer than the calendar showed. They were easy together in a way that felt earned, the ease of two people who had been honest with each other early and found the honesty held. She showed him the farm's accounts, which were tight but sustainable, and he showed her the work he was doing on Call's books, and they argued pleasantly about the best way to manage a winter feed reserve, and she was right and he told her so, and she did not make a production of it. There was a Sunday in late November when the sky cleared after 3 days of gray, and the light came out sharp and clean off the frozen ground, and Martin had the afternoon free from Call's and rode over, and Maggie was standing in the yard looking at the creek with her coat on, and her face turned up to the sun. "Come walk," she said, when he got down from Copper, and they walked along the creek bank together in the cold, clean afternoon, through the bare cottonwoods whose branches were silver against the blue sky, and Maggie talked about what she wanted to do with the farm in the spring, a larger kitchen garden, a third field of feed grain, and Martin listened and thought about the farm with the particular attention of a man who was beginning to imagine himself in it. He reached over and took her hand. She looked down at their joined hands and then up at him, and she did not pull away. They walked the rest of the way along the creek in that configuration, and he thought he had never been as conscious of a specific thing as he was of the weight and warmth of her hand in his, the way she walked beside him exactly matching his pace without any adjustment from either of them. At the turning point where the creek bent south and the cottonwoods ended, she stopped and looked up at him. "Martin," she said. "Maggie," he said. And she reached up and touched his face with her free hand, the lightest possible touch at the jaw, and said, "I am very glad you came to my gate." He turned his head slightly and pressed his lips to her palm, just briefly, and felt her fingers curl. "I am sorry for the reason I came," he said. "I am not," she said. "The reason you came was Thomas's carelessness, and Thomas's carelessness is not mine to carry anymore." She looked at him steadily. "What matters is what you did when you got there." December came with snow, and Martin spent the work days at Call's doing the heavy winter labor of a cattle operation in cold weather, and the evenings at Maggie's farm, and he began, in a practical and unspoken way, to do the work of the farm in addition to his work at Call's, repairing the fence on the north pasture, clearing the snow from the barn roof when it built up, ensuring the water line stayed workable. Maggie watched him take this on without being asked, and without making a ceremony of it, and she matched it with her own quiet reciprocity, sending him back to the bunkhouse with food and once, when his coat was genuinely inadequate for the temperature, appearing with a heavier one that had been her father's and fit him well enough. He had not yet told her directly what was in his mind about the future, because he was not a man who spoke of the future until he had something solid to offer it. But he was saving money from the Cali wages, putting aside more each month than he spent, and he had sent a letter to a cousin in New Mexico who had mentioned available land, and he had stopped thinking about anywhere else when he thought about where he would be in a year. One evening in December, Jim Cali sat down beside him after supper in the main house, and looked at him with the direct simplicity of a man who had observed something and wanted to say so. "You are over at the Underwood place considerable," Jim said. "I am," Martin said. "She is a good woman," Jim said. "Steady. Ran that farm herself since April without asking a soul for help." He paused. "I would not want to see her made a fool of." "I do not intend to make her a fool of anything," Martin said. Jim nodded slowly. "Good," he said, and went back to his pipe. The second payment to Cecil Harrow went out in November, the third in December. Martin sent them himself, and on the December trip he ran into Roy Hester again outside the Ivory Saloon, and this time Roy was less genial. He said that Cecil was not happy with Martin for various reasons, that Cecil felt Martin had undercut his operation by negotiating rather than collecting, and that Cecil might have reason to revisit the arrangement. Martin listened to all of this without changing expression. Then he said, "Cecil Harrow is a man who lends money at rates that would make a judge uncomfortable, and the widow whose name he gave me to collect from can document the nature of his operation clearly enough that a county magistrate would find it instructive reading. He knows that, and I know that, and if he has the wisdom God gave reasonable men, he will take his $42 paid on time and consider the matter closed." Roy Hester did not have a good answer for that. Martin rode back to Coldwater Creek feeling the cold at his back and thinking about the conversation and whether Cecil Harrow would actually cause trouble. He thought it was unlikely. Cecil was a coward by temperament, a man who picked only the fights he was certain to win, and the calculation Martin had laid out for him was designed to make sure he was not certain. Christmas came without ceremony at Call's ranch, a good meal and a day off, and Martin spent it at Maggie's farm. She had made a cake, a real one with dried fruit and spices, and the house smelled like cinnamon and warm wood, and she had put pine boughs on the table and in the windowsill, and when he arrived she was wearing a blue dress he had not seen before, a Sunday dress, and she looked different in it. Not better or worse, just different, more formal and at the same time more deliberate, as though she had chosen it specifically for the day and therefore for him. He had brought her a book. He had spent considerable time in the Abilene store thinking about it, and had finally chosen a natural history of the Texas territory because she had mentioned once that she wanted to know more about the land she was farming and its patterns, its seasons and its creatures and its water. The bookseller had it second-hand, and it was a good copy. She held it in her hands for a moment, and then she said, "This is exactly right," in a voice that was quieter than usual. They ate the cake and drank coffee by the fire, and she read aloud to him from the natural history, the section on the creek systems of central Texas. And her voice reading was a specific pleasure he had not anticipated, measured and clear with occasional commentary when she found something she disagreed with or found surprising. And the afternoon went by in that warm light, and he did not want it to end. When he finally stood to go, in the early evening she walked him to the door, and they stood in the doorway with the cold coming in from outside and the warmth of the house at their backs, and she looked up at him and he looked at her and he said, "Maggie, I want to ask you something." "Ask," she said. "Not tonight," he said. "I want to have something more solid than a December evening and good intentions before I ask." She studied him. "I am not a woman who needs to be won," she said. "I am a woman who needs to know the truth." "The truth is that I intend to ask you to marry me," he said, "and I want to do it properly, with a plan that makes sense for both of us, not out of feeling alone but out of something built." The word marry sat in the air between them, clear and certain. "That is the truth," she said after a moment. "Yes," he said. She nodded once slowly, with an expression that he was beginning to be able to read, the particular stillness that meant she was holding something carefully. "Then I will wait for the plan," she said. He rode back to Call's in the dark, and the stars were enormous and cold overhead, and he was already thinking about the spring. January passed in cold work and evening warmth, and Martin wrote 3 letters and received 2 in return from his cousin in New Mexico, and from a land office in the county that had information about a parcel that had come open 4 miles east of Calais, 120 acres with creek access, and a small existing structure that could serve as a start. He went to look at the land on a clear January afternoon, riding the perimeter in the cold, and found it good. The creek access was real, and the soil looked workable, and the structure, a 2-room cabin in decent repair, was more than he had expected. He went back and sat with the numbers for a week. He had saved $103, and the land office wanted $150 for the parcel, and he had $47 to find. He thought about this for 3 days, and then he went to Jim Callie and explained the situation. Not all of it, but the part about the land. And Callie listened, and then loaned him $50 at no interest on the condition that Martin stayed on as ranch hand through the following fall at the current wage, which was a good deal, and Martin shook on it immediately. He filed the land claim on the 15th of January, 1879, and rode back to Coldwater Creek in the late afternoon and knocked on Maggie's door with the deed copy in his inside pocket. She opened the door and looked at him, and then at his expression, and something in her face went very still. "Come in," she said. He came in and took off his coat and hat and stood in the middle of her kitchen, which was warm and smelled like the soup on the stove, and he looked at her standing across from him with her hands folded, and that steady full attention she brought to everything. And he thought about a September evening at a gate and every conversation since, and the particular shape of her hand in his along the frozen creek bank. He took the deed out of his pocket. He set it on the table between them. She looked at it. 120 acres, he said, 4 miles east on the creek. Existing cabin, creek access, good soil. It borders your eastern pasture. He paused. I filed the claim this morning. She looked at the deed for a long moment and then up at him. You have been planning this since December, she said. Since November, he said honestly. Her eyes were very dark and very direct. Martin, she said, I want to ask you to marry me, he said. Not because the land is there or because the plan makes sense, though it does. Because there is not a day that goes by that I am not thinking about being in the same room with you. And there is not a thing in my life that does not look more worth having when I imagine it with you in it. He paused. I came to your door with a debt to collect, and I sat down and forgot everything I had prepared. And the only honest explanation I have for that is that you are a woman who makes a man want to be better than his assignment. Maggie Underwood stood in her kitchen in the lamplight and looked at him for a long time, and he could see her working through the truth of it, checking it against her own careful internal accounting, weighing it and measuring it and finding it real. Yes, she said. The word was simple and complete, and it landed in him like something coming home. He crossed the room and she stepped toward him, and he took her hands in his and looked at her face at close range for the first time without the table or the fireplace between them. And she looked back at him with those dark eyes that had been assessing him since September and which now, for the first time, were simply open. He kissed her. Carefully, because she deserved care, and she kissed him back with the same straightforward honesty she brought to every other thing. And the soup on the stove simmered on, and outside Coldwater Creek went about its business in the cold January evening, indifferent to the particular reorganization of 2 lives that was happening at its edge. They married in February, on a Saturday when the weather was clear and cold, and the sky was the deep blue that only comes in winter. The ceremony was at the small church in town, officiated by the minister who served Coldwater Creek every other Sunday, and who seemed genuinely pleased by the occasion. Jim Callie and his wife attended, and Maggie's nearest neighbor, a woman named Clara Fitch who ran her own farm with her brother, stood with Maggie as witness. Maggie wore the blue dress from Christmas with a white collar she had added herself, and she walked in under her own certainty and stood beside Martin at the front of the church and said her vows in the clear, precise voice she used when she meant every word, which was always. Martin said his in a voice that came out steadier than he expected, given that his heart was doing something considerably less steady behind it. Jim Calley shook his hand afterward with the solemnity of a man who has been waiting to do exactly this. Clara Fitch embraced Maggie and whispered something that made Maggie press her cheek briefly to Clara's, and the minister offered his sincere congratulations and a short homily about the frontier and partnership that was, Martin had to admit, not badly conceived. The fourth and final payment to Cecil Harrow went out in January, hand-delivered by Martin with a copy of the payment schedule, and a signed receipt form that Cecil provided with the sour expression of a man who has been outmaneuvered but cannot admit it. The account was formally closed. Martin kept his copy of the closure document in the inside pocket of his coat for several months before he finally gave it to Maggie, not because he was holding it for any purpose, but because it felt like the thing she ought to have. She took it from him and looked at it for a moment, and then folded it carefully and set it in the box where she kept her important papers. Thomas would have thought the whole thing was a great deal of fuss, she said. He never understood the weight of debts. Some people do not, Martin said. You understand them very well, she said, given that collecting them is how we met. I was never very good at collecting them, he said. She looked at him sideways. I noticed, she said. They moved into the cabin on the new land in early March, when the weather broke enough to make travel practical, and the interior repairs Martin had been doing through January and February were complete. The cabin was not large, 2 rooms and a good fireplace and a new floor Martin had laid himself in February, but it was solid and warm, and it sat on good land with the creek visible from the front window. Maggie's farm remained in her name. That had been Martin's clear position from the beginning, that the property she had managed and maintained and paid the debts on was hers and would stay hers. And they ran the 2 properties together as a single operation with the practical logic of adjoining landholders who happened to be married. The cattle were moved between the 2 pastures according to season and grazing condition. The vegetable production was consolidated on Maggie's side, where the garden was already established, and the new land on Martin's parcel was brought into feed grain production for the combined herd. It was a good operation. It was the kind of good that comes not from luck, but from the combination of 2 people who both understand work and have decided to apply themselves to the same direction. And in the spring of 1879, with the new grass coming up along Coldwater Creek and the winter behind them, it showed every sign of growing. Martin worked out his contract with Jim Calley through the following fall as agreed, and then returned full-time to their own land. Calley gave him a strong handshake and a bottle of good whiskey on the last day, and said, without apparent irony, that he hoped Martin would consider occasional work if things got busy, and Martin said he would and meant it, because Jim Calley was a decent man and the cattle business was not so separate from his own that the work would conflict. Spring brought its particular cascade of urgencies, calving and planting and fencing, and a late March storm that took down part of the new barn roof and required 3 days of repair in cold, wet weather. Martin spent those 3 days on the roof and came down each evening to a warm house and dry clothes that Maggie had laid by the fire and food on the table, and the particular quality of her presence that he had been discovering, every day, was more essential than he had known to account for. She was not a soft woman in the way that the word soft usually meant. She was not gentle in the manner of someone who avoids difficulty. She was soft in the more specific sense of being without unnecessary harshness, of applying no more force than a situation required, of understanding the difference between firmness and cruelty, and choosing always to stay on the right side of it. She cried exactly twice in the spring, once over a calf that did not survive its first night despite everything, and once reading a letter from her sister in Missouri that contained news Martin did not ask about because she did not offer it, and both times she cried briefly and privately and moved on. He loved her thoroughly. That was the fact of it, plain and complete, the kind of love that is not a feeling that arrives and might leave but a settled decision that has been tested by daily reality and found sound. He had not expected to love anyone this way, having lived long enough without it to have quietly concluded that it was not in his nature, and finding it there and fully formed was something he thought about often, not with surprise exactly, but with a gratitude that he expressed poorly in words and better in other ways. She knew. That was the other fact. She knew in the way that she knew most things, with precision and without making a performance of it, and she returned it in the same manner, directly and without ceremony but absolutely consistently, every day. By summer the operation was profitable enough to clear a reasonable margin above expenses, and Martin spent part of it on improvements to the cabin, a larger main room, a proper porch where they sat in the evenings watching the creek, and a second bedroom that had a purpose he had not yet stated but which Maggie understood because she understood most things. On an August evening when the light was low and gold, and the creek was down to its summer trickle, and everything smelled like dry grass and coming coolness, Maggie came out to the porch where he was sitting and sat beside him and said, "I believe I am going to have a child." Martin Garrett looked at his wife in the gold August light and felt something in him that he had no adequate description for, something that was composed of joy and terror, and a very specific kind of responsibility that settled into his chest like a stone settling into a riverbed, finding its permanent place. "Are you certain?" he said. "I am not guessing," she said, with the edge of dry humor she used when she found his questions adequately answered by themselves. He took her hand. She let him hold it and looked at the creek in the calm way she had of encountering large information. "Are you frightened?" he asked. "Somewhat," she said. "Are you?" "Considerably," he said. "Good," she said. "Appropriate concern is healthy." He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, just slightly, the specific lean she used when she was being close without making a spectacle of it, and they sat on the porch in the gold summer evening and watched the creek and thought about the future. Dr. Harmon in town was a steady, reliable man who had been practicing medicine in the territory for 15 years, and he confirmed the pregnancy in September and said everything was proceeding as it should. And Maggie thanked him in the brisk manner she used for all business interactions and went home and spent the evening making a list of things they would need to prepare. Martin read the list over her shoulder. "I can build the crib," he said. "I know you can," she said. "That is why it is on the list." He built the crib in October. From cedar he cut himself on the creek bank, working in the evenings by lamplight, taking more care with the joinery than he had taken with any previous carpentry project. Maggie came and watched sometimes, leaning in the workshop doorway with her hands resting on the swell of her middle, and he worked under her observation with the focused self-consciousness of a man who wants to do the thing correctly. "It is well made," she said, one evening. "Not finished yet," he said. "When it is finished it will be very well made," she said. Fall moved through with its color and cold, and the cattle were brought in close and the garden was cleared, and the woodpile was built up to a size that Martin checked 3 times and Maggie checked twice, and both of them agreed was adequate for the worst winter could produce. Clara Fitch came by often, checking on Maggie with the easy practicality of a woman neighbor who has no use for unnecessary worry and every use for actual help. And she and Maggie sat at the kitchen table together and talked about what Maggie could expect with the matter-of-fact specificity of women who have learned that honesty is kinder than reassurance. Martin was grateful for Clara Fitch. He was doing his best with the available information, and his best included admitting that there were things he did not know and people who knew them better, and Clara was the most useful of those people, patient with his questions when he had them and direct in her answers. The baby came in December, 1 year after the Christmas when Martin had brought Maggie the book about the territory, and they had sat in the firelight reading about creek systems, which felt to Martin like a meaningful accident of timing, the kind of thing that a person with religious inclinations might call a sign. It was a long night, and Clara was there, and Dr. Harmon was there, and Martin was in the main room with the fire built up high because Maggie had asked him to keep the house warm, which was the specific instruction she had given him, as a way of keeping him occupied and present without having him underfoot. He paced and fed the fire and listened to the sounds from the bedroom and told himself in a low and private voice all the things he knew about difficulty and endurance and the likelihood of good outcomes, which was a list he recited 3 times through before the bedroom door opened, and Clara Fitch came out with an expression of satisfied competence. "A boy," she said. "Both of them are well. You can go in." Martin went in. Maggie was propped up against the pillows looking, in his honest assessment, like a woman who had done an enormous amount of work and was not going to say so. She was pale and her hair was loose, and she was holding a small wrapped bundle with both arms and looking down at it with an expression he had never seen on her face before, something completely open and undisguised. She looked up when he came in. "Come and meet him," she said. Martin sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son, who was very small and very red and extremely serious in his expression, considering the world with an intensity that Martin found immediately recognizable as Maggie's way of looking at things. "He looks like you," Martin said. "He looks like himself," Maggie said. "Give him time." Martin reached out and touched the baby's cheek with one finger very carefully, the way you touch something you are afraid of breaking, and the baby turned toward the touch with the automatic seeking motion of someone who has been in the world for 8 minutes and already has opinions about it. "William," Maggie said. "I would like to call him William if you are agreeable." Martin looked at her. "For your father." "He would have liked you," she said, and her voice was entirely steady, but she was looking at him with that fully open expression, the one she had shown him first in the barn doorway on the morning he had left to go talk to Cecil Harrow, and he understood that it was the most important thing she had said to him in all their time together, which was not nothing. "William," he said. "Yes." Clara Fitch made tea in the kitchen, and Dr. Harmon wrote the necessary record, and Martin sat beside Maggie on the bed with his son in the crook of his arm and his wife's head on his shoulder, and the fire going good and strong in the other room, and the creek running dark and cold outside in the December night. William Garrett was a serious baby who became a vigorous toddler, pulling himself upright in the spring of the following year, and walking at 10 months with the determined competence of a child who had decided the ground-level view was insufficient. He had Martin's build and Maggie's eyes, and the particular combination of their temperaments that produced a person who was both curious and careful, which seemed to Martin like a very fine way to come into the world. The land produced well through 1880. They expanded the cattle operation in the spring, purchasing 12 additional head from a ranch to the north that was being sold up, and the feed grain from Martin's original parcel covered the winter requirements with margin. Maggie's kitchen garden had grown to 1/2 acre and supplied them through the summer and left a surplus for trade at the Coldwater Creek trading post. They were not wealthy. That was not the shape of the life. But the life had shape, and the shape was good, and every morning Martin woke up in the same house as Maggie Underwood and their son and the work waiting on the land, and he looked at the ceiling above their bed and felt the particular satisfaction of a man who knows he is exactly where he is supposed to be. There was a matter in the spring of 1880 that required settling. Roy Hester came through Coldwater Creek in late April, which was not a coincidence because there was nothing about Roy Hester that was a coincidence, and he stopped at the trading post and was there when Martin came in for supplies on a Tuesday morning. Roy Hester was with another man Martin did not know, and they were deep in conversation that stopped when Martin came in. Martin bought his supplies. He was aware of Roy Hester the whole time, the way you are aware of a sore tooth, and he was aware that Roy Hester was watching him with the specific attention of a man who has information he wants to deploy. At the door, Roy said, "Cecil Harrow is selling the ivory operation, moving to New Mexico." Martin paused. "Is he?" "Thought you would want to know," Roy said. "Seeing as how your transaction with him was such an interesting piece of business." "It was a business transaction," Martin said. "It concluded satisfactorily for all parties." There is nothing more interesting in it than that. Roy Hester smiled. You married the woman. I married my wife, Martin said. Her name is Maggie Garrett, and she is the best farmer in this valley and a woman of more substance than either of us. And whatever you are working toward with this conversation, I suggest you arrive there directly. Roy Hester looked at him for a moment with the expression of a man recalculating. Cecil asked me to mention that he still has your name in a file, Roy said slowly. Various transactions, in case anyone was looking. Martin looked at him. He had been expecting something like this, in the vague way that you expect weather in the spring, knowing it will come and not knowing exactly when or what shape. Roy, he said, I left that work 18 months ago. The people I worked for then were paid what they were owed, and I have nothing outstanding. If Cecil Harrow wants to inventory his files, he is welcome to do so, and he will find that everything I did in his employ was legal under Texas law and adequately documented. If there is something specific you are referencing, say it plainly. Roy Hester said nothing specifically. Martin walked out and loaded his supplies onto the wagon and drove home, and he sat with it for 2 days before he told Maggie, because he wanted to be sure of his own thinking before he complicated hers. He told her on the porch on a Thursday evening while William was asleep inside. She listened with her full attention, and then she was quiet for a moment. Is there anything in those files that would be a serious problem? She said. No, he said. The work I did was lawful. Unpleasant in some cases and not work I am proud of in the moral sense, but legally clean. Then Roy Hester is bluffing with a hand that has very little in it, she said. I think so, he said. I think Cecil is leaving the territory because he knows that his lending operation is getting close to the edge of what the county magistrate will tolerate, and he is making noise about files as a way of feeling like he is leaving on his own terms. And Roy Hester is delivering the noise, she said. Yes. She looked at the creek. Let me know if it becomes more than noise, she said. In the meantime, I think the corn needs checking in the morning. Martin looked at his wife in the evening light and thought that her capacity to assess a threat and then move directly to the practical next thing was one of the finest qualities a person could have. The corn does need checking, he said. Cecil Harrow left the territory by May, and Roy Hester went with him, and the files were apparently not of sufficient interest to anyone to materialize into actual trouble. Martin heard from Jim Calley in June that the Ivory Saloon had new owners and was being run as a straightforward drinking establishment without backroom operations, which was a general improvement in the county's moral atmosphere. Summer of 1880 was a good one. The rains came in June and July when they were needed. The creek stayed up through August, which was unusual and welcome, and the harvest in fall was the best they had put together since taking over the combined operation. William learned to say several words with great conviction, the most frequent being the word no, which Maggie received with equanimity, and which Martin found privately hilarious. They had a dinner at the cabin in September, Maggie's idea, inviting Jim Calley and his wife Alina and Clara Fitch and her brother Samuel and the minister who came through on Sundays. And it was the first time Martin had sat at his own table at the head of a gathering of people, and felt that the gathering reflected something real about his life, rather than something incidental to it. Maggie had cooked for 2 days and the table was full, and William sat in his high chair eating things he was allowed to eat and reaching for things he was not, and the laughter in the room was the kind that is not performed, but simply happens when people are actually glad to be together. After the guests had gone and William was in bed and the dishes were done, Maggie stood at the kitchen window looking out at the dark, and Martin came and stood behind her and put his hands on her shoulders, and she leaned back against him, her full weight, which she did rarely and which he therefore measured each time, understanding it as the specific gift it was. Do you know what I was thinking tonight? She said. Tell me. That Thomas and I never had people to dinner, she said. In 6 years it never happened. I did not realize until tonight how much that was not the life I wanted and how much this is. He pressed his lips to the top of her head. "I thought about you on the porch in September," he said. "The first evening. What did you think?" "I thought I was not good enough for the conversation I was about to sit down to," he said. "And I did not want to be the reason that expression left your face." She turned and looked at him. In the low lamplight, her face was as known to him as his own hands, every particular of it mapped by 2 years of daily attention, and still capable of doing the thing where it stopped him. "You were always good enough," she said. "You just needed to believe it." He kissed her properly, the way that meant everything, and she kissed him back with the same complete honesty she had brought to every other thing. And the lamp burned on, and the October dark pressed at the window, and inside their cabin on the creek the life they had built held its good and solid shape. By the spring of 1881, the operation had grown enough that they hired a hand, a young man of 19 named Pete Vargas from a family that had been in the territory for 2 generations, who was good with horses and honest and quiet, and who took to the work with the reliable steadiness of someone who understood that good work was its own reward. Maggie treated him with the same direct practical respect she applied to all people, and Pete Vargas in return treated the farm with the careful attention of someone who has been trusted and does not intend to waste the trust. William at 16 months was a person with strong opinions about breakfast and a deep philosophical engagement with the dirt in the garden, which he felt deserved more investigation than he was generally permitted. He followed Pete Vargas around when Pete was working near the house, and Pete took this in stride with the good-humored patience of someone who had younger siblings and understood the essential nature of small children. Martin and Maggie were sitting on the porch one evening in April, the spring evening full of the smell of new grass and the creek running high with snowmelt, when Maggie said, without apparent preamble, "I have been thinking about the East Field." "The East Field," Martin said. "We should plant wheat," she said. "The price is good and it will rotate well with the grain we have in the north pasture." She paused. "And I have been thinking that with wheat we would have enough to build a proper drying shed which would let us expand the dried goods for market." Martin thought about this. "The East Field is 40 acres, he said. "We would need to break the south quarter before planting. That is 6 weeks of work." "Pete can take the north fence and the cattle management," she said. "We break the south quarter together. 6 weeks with 2 people working it is 3 weeks." He looked at her. She was looking at the East Field in the fading light with the focused attention of someone who has already run the numbers and is now verifying them against the actual landscape. "You have thought this through," he said. "I have been thinking it through since February," she said. "I waited until I was certain." "You are always certain before you speak," he said. "It has saved us both considerable trouble," she said. He looked at the East Field. He looked at his wife. He thought about the debt of $42.60, and the piece of paper in a dead man's handwriting, and the gate he had stopped at on a September evening in 1878, and the way she had turned in the yard with the bucket in her hand and looked at him without flinching. "Let us plant wheat," he said. The East Field was broken and planted by June, and the wheat came up in July, green and promising. And in the evenings they walked the field together, Maggie and Martin and William between them, the boy's small, serious face turned down to the plants with the expression of someone forming important conclusions. Maggie would describe things to him, the names of plants and the way the soil worked, and the reason the creek mattered, in the simple, direct language she used with everyone, and William listened with an attention that seemed already to understand more than it should. The summer moved on, and the life moved on with it, growing its particular shape, adding rooms and acres and seasons, and the stories that accumulate when 2 people build something together over time. There was a fall when Martin took 3 days and went back through the country he had come from, north toward Abilene, not for any specific purpose, but because he had not gone back and he wanted to close that loop in his own mind. He rode through the country he had crossed in September of 1878, the scrub flats and the long grass and the ridge above Coldwater Creek, and he stopped at the top of the ridge and looked down at the valley below, and at the distance, where the original farm was still visible, smoke from Maggie's cookstove going up even from this far. He was not the same man who had ridden down this ridge 2 years ago. That was not a thing he said aloud, because it was not the kind of thing that needed to be said. But he sat on Copper, who was getting older now but was still steady and reliable and still had the mild disinterest of a horse who had seen too much to be surprised by anything, and he looked at the valley and thought about who he had been and what he had done with who he had become. He rode down the ridge and home. Maggie was in the yard when he came through the gate, and she looked up from what she was doing and her face did the thing. "You were gone 3 days," she said. "I said I would be," he said. "I know," she said. "I am not complaining. I am saying I am glad you are back." He got down from Copper and led the horse to the barn and rubbed him down and fed him. And when he came out, Maggie was on the porch with 2 cups of coffee, and William had fallen asleep against her side in the warm late afternoon, his dark head on her arm, and the creek went about its business in the cottonwoods, and the farm sat in its good, solid order. And Martin Garrett walked up the porch steps and sat beside his wife and took his coffee and said nothing, because everything that needed to be said was already present in the shape of the moment. They sat like that until the sun was down and the stars were coming up, and William woke up enough to say "Papa" in the sleepy voice of a child making sure of his bearings, and Martin said "Right here," and William put his head back down and went back to sleep, and Maggie said, very quietly, without looking at him because she did not always need to look at him to say the real things, "I am glad it was a debt." Martin thought about that. He thought about Cecil Harrow and the $8 and the piece of paper with the name on it. "I am glad of everything that brought me to your gate," he said. She turned and looked at him then, fully in the dark with the stars behind her head and the lamplight from the window touching the edge of her face. "Even the debt," she said. "Especially the debt," he said. "The second child came in the winter of 1882, a daughter this time, whom they named Frances after Martin's mother, a woman he had not spoken of much but of whom he spoke now, deliberately, wanting the name to carry its meaning forward. Frances was darker than William, with more of Maggie in her from the beginning, and she had a disposition that was somehow both fiercer and more open-hearted than her brother's careful seriousness. And from her first weeks, she responded to voices with a focused intensity that made the whole household feel noticed. William accepted his sister with the equanimity of a 2-year-old who had not been consulted, but was willing to be reasonable about it. And within a month, he had appointed himself her primary observer, reporting on her activities to anyone who would listen with the gravity of a small person who has found a serious responsibility. Pete Vargas brought flowers to the house when he heard the news, a handful of early wildflowers he had found on the creek bank, which he presented to Maggie with a shyness that was enormously endearing, and which Maggie received with the warm practicality she used to make people feel that their offerings were exactly right. The year Frances was born, the East Field produced its second wheat harvest, and the drying shed was built, and the operation turned a profit that allowed Martin to pay off the remaining balance of the land note 2 years ahead of schedule, and to put money aside for the first time in a quantity that felt like actual security rather than just sufficiency. Maggie tracked all of it in the account book she kept, and presented the year's summary to Martin in January in the manner of someone presenting a well-constructed argument, and Martin looked at the numbers and then at his wife and thought again about who he had been. "We are going to be all right," he said. "We have been all right for some time," she said, with the dry precision of someone correcting a factual error in an otherwise acceptable statement. "Better than all right," he revised. "Yes," she said. "Better than all right." They were in the kitchen when he said it, Frances in the cradle by the stove and William in the yard under Pete's indirect supervision, and the morning light came through the east window across the table where the account book lay open, and it was an ordinary morning in all the ways that extraordinary things are built out of ordinary mornings accumulated. And Martin Garrett looked at his wife and his sleeping daughter and the light on the page, and thought that a man who had been given a name on a piece of paper and had arrived at a gate in September with a 3-day-old speech ready to deliver, had in the end found that forgetting the speech was the best work he had ever done. He reached across the table and covered Maggie's hand with his. She turned her hand over and held his. Outside, William was explaining something at length to Pete Vargas, who was listening with the patient attention of a good young man who understood his place in the extended household and valued it. And the creek ran on in the cottonwoods, and the wheat in the east field was weeks away from planting, and the soil was ready, and the drying shed stood new and solid in the morning light, and everything was built and present and ongoing, and the land knew the shape of them both by now. And the life they had made had stopped being something to prove and become simply what it was. A man and a woman and 2 children and a creek and good land and years ahead of them, warm with the ordinary extraordinary fact of being exactly where they were supposed to be, in the country they had made their own, in the life they had built from a September evening and a piece of paper, and the particular mercy of forgetting what you came to say.